Target the core engines and hold nothing back, Commander Jorlin Keevan barked, his voice cutting through the tension in the war room like a knife. The air inside was thick, stifling, a low murmur of static and the faint tap of fingers on touchscreens filling the space. The holographic map flickered before him, projecting the image of an alien fleet hovering just above Earth's atmosphere, silent and ominous. The lights overhead flickered intermittently, a subtle reminder of the dwindling power reserves that pulsed through the Resistance's makeshift command center. There was no room for error. He turned sharply to his left, eyes narrowing at the tactical display that flickered like a broken mirror. His fingers twitched with the tension of waiting. Every nerve in his body was screaming for action, but the strangest thing was happening. There was no explosion, no sudden chaos, no frenzy of alien firepower. Just an unnerving silence from the skies above. Earth's air felt almost too still, as if the planet itself were holding its breath. "Sir, they're not moving," Lieutenant Madeira Voss said quietly, her voice unusually steady for the circumstances. The young woman's face was pale, though, and her fingers were trembling against the tablet in her hand. Madeira had been with the Resistance from the very beginning, and the fear in her eyes now wasn't something he was used to seeing. Jorlin's pulse quickened. His eyes scanned the alien fleet that filled the sky in an uncanny stillness. The Yuthar Empire was known for their brutal invasions, sweeping through planets like a plague of locusts. They didn't wait. They crushed, they burned, they subjugated. But here, now on Earth, they lingered in eerie suspension, almost like they were waiting for something. He couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his gut. "They're waiting for us to make the first move, aren't they?" Madeira continued, her voice small, distant. Jorlin met her gaze, a flicker of realization settling in. Her words made the situation more bizarre than it already was. The Ithar fleet hovered like an oversized moon, their massive vessels casting shadows that swallowed entire cities below. From this altitude, Jorlin could see it all: lives, hopes, dreams, suspended in the stillness of an uncertain world. And yet in that moment he couldn't feel the usual fire of rage or fear. Just an overwhelming sense of dread, as if humanity were stuck between a deep chasm and an unknown abyss. He spoke in a low growl, his voice carrying the weight of thousands of years of human history. They don't know us." The words hung in the air, heavy and pregnant with meaning. His team knew what he meant. They weren't about to charge in with a futile attack. Humans didn't fight like that. They adapted, they survived, and when the Yuthar least expected it, they would be swallowed whole. "Commander, we're reading an incoming transmission from their flagship," Sergeant Karojin said, his tone steady, though his eyes betrayed the unease running through him. His fingers hovered above the console, a bead of sweat dripping down his face. Jorlin turned sharply, his voice tight. "On screen." The transmission was crystal clear, the alien language flowing from the speakers with a chilling finality, but the image it projected spoke volumes. It was a simple message: "We are here. Submit." There was no demand for war, no threats of annihilation, just that one cold sentence, cutting through the distance between the invaders and Earth with unnerving precision. The image lingered for a moment longer than Jorlin liked. The Yuthar flag hanging behind the alien diplomat, like an unholy banner of conquest. "Why are they waiting?" Madeira whispered, her question more rhetorical than anything else. Jorlin didn't respond immediately. His gaze drifted to the windows, where the faint outline of the alien fleet could still be seen in the distance, a stark contrast to the soft light of Earth's early morning sun. The sky seemed impossibly blue today, almost too perfect, too serene. "I'm not sure," Jorlin muttered, stepping away from the screen. He looked over at his officers, each one as tense as a wire stretched to the breaking point. He could see the doubt beginning to creep into their eyes, but he refused to show his own. "But we will not give them the satisfaction of thinking we're scared. We don't bow to invaders, not even ones who think they've already won." His hand tightened into a fist, knuckles whitening. The feeling of the cool, smooth metal beneath his palm was grounding, like a tether pulling him back from the edge of something terrible. The air around him seemed to grow heavy, charged, like the anticipation before a storm. And then it happened. A low rumble, a sound far deeper than anything Earth had ever experienced, began to vibrate through the ground beneath his feet. It wasn't the thundering roar of rockets or the earth-shattering tremor of an incoming attack. No, it was something far more unsettling. It felt like the Earth itself had exhaled, a deep sigh of acceptance. "Commander," Lieutenant Madeira whispered, her voice barely audible. They're not here to destroy us, are they?" Jorlin met her gaze again, but this time there was no answer. Not yet. Instead, he felt his thoughts collide, and the weight of the situation pressed down on him like an iron cage. This wasn't the war he'd been prepared for. The invasion wasn't coming with the usual signs of violence. There were no explosions, no waves of terror crashing down. The silence was too much. The rest of the team waited for his command. In that moment, all of humanity seemed to hang in the balance. Would they resist? Would they fight back, as they had so many times before? "Stay calm," he finally said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of uncertainty. "This isn't over. They've made a mistake. We have time." He turned back to the screen. The Ythar hadn't made their move yet, but they were waiting, watching. They had underestimated Earth. The quiet before the storm had settled too heavily in his chest, and in his bones he could feel the coming shift. The waiting game had begun, and this time Jorlin Caven wouldn't let humanity fall. Not without a fight. The stillness of the sky had not abated. The alien fleet remained suspended like a monstrous, silent storm cloud, its presence looming far beyond the horizon. Inside the command center, the oppressive weight of silence stretched further, tightening around them. Even as Jorlin stood among his team, feeling the sharp edges of uncertainty pressing into his ribs, the air felt thick, as if the entire world were waiting for something, anything, to happen. "Sir, they're still not responding," Lieutenant Madeira Voss muttered, her fingers skimming over the console in front of her, the steady clack of her nails the only sound in the room. Her eyes flickered toward Jorlin, a thin line of sweat tracing down her temple. Despite her usual composure, the tension was wearing on her, the weight gnawing at all of them. The planet had never felt this quiet before. No urgent beeping from sensors, no emergency sirens, just the eerie sense that something vast and uncontrollable was drawing closer. "We can't keep waiting like this, Commander," Sergeant Karo Jin added, his voice low but thick with anxiety. He leaned forward, his fingers brushing against the holographic map, projecting ghostly images of the Ythar fleet. It wasn't just the fleet that haunted their minds. There were human lives below, still unaware of what was coming. The peaceful, quiet cities were now surrounded by an invisible noose, drawing tighter with each passing minute. Karo's breath came in shallow bursts as he kept glancing nervously at the ceiling, as though expecting it to come crashing down. Jorlin turned slowly, eyes narrowing. "Patience. They're expecting us to act first. They don't know us. Not yet." His words hung in the air, a challenge and a warning. If the Ythar thought humanity was weak, they would soon find out just how wrong they were. Jorlin wasn't sure what they were planning, but he knew one thing for certain. They had time. The planet had time, and that, in itself, was a weapon. "We need to give them a reason to make the first move," Jorlin said, his voice sharp but controlled, cutting through the oppressive quiet. The room fell silent, each of his officers waiting for the next order. Jorlin stood unmoving for a long moment, eyes darting to the tactical maps again, the blue light from the screens casting harsh shadows on his face. The weight of the decision pressed down on him, but he knew the longer they waited, the stronger the Ythar would become. His mind raced with possibilities, but he had to focus. They couldn't afford any mistakes. "We'll disrupt their communications," he continued, his gaze moving from face to face. "Every key transmission, every incoming signal, we'll turn it into noise. Their fleet will be blind, unable to coordinate their forces. This will be our opening." Karo and Madeira exchanged a quick, uneasy glance. It wasn't a full-out offensive, just a distraction, something that would test the Ythar's grip on their dominance. Jorland's mind had already shifted into war mode, where calculations and timing were everything. He understood the need for a precise surgical strike, something that would confuse and disorient their invaders, making them question their assumptions about Earth's capability. But even as he outlined the plan, a quiet doubt lingered at the edge of his thoughts. What if it didn't work? What if the Ethar were prepared for this kind of subtlety? The room seemed to grow heavier, the cold air pressing in from every corner. They could hear the faint tapping of their fingers against consoles, a reminder that this moment, while small, was crucial. "Operation Ghost," Jorland finally announced, breaking the silence that had been festering in the room. "It's time." 2 days later, Earth's resistance forces had begun to implement the plan. In hidden underground bunkers scattered across the globe, teams of engineers worked tirelessly, setting up electromagnetic devices that would scramble the alien fleet's communications. It wasn't an all-out attack, but a disruption, an invitation to chaos. Jorland watched it unfold on a massive screen in the command room. His fingers drummed the surface of the table, an unconscious rhythm that reflected his inner unease. The electromagnetic pulses began to emit, creating a vast ripple in the Ethar network. For a brief moment, the alien fleet faltered. Sensors flickered and died, transmissions were twisted into incomprehensible static, and the once precise movements of the fleet came to a sudden halt. Jorland felt a strange sense of satisfaction, but it was fleeting. The Ethar would adapt, he knew that. They always did. And it wouldn't be long before they found their footing again. But right now, humanity had an edge, a small but significant one. "We've got their attention now," Madeira said, breaking the silence. Her voice was sharper than usual, though the flicker of doubt in her eyes told Jorland she was still uncertain about the next steps. No one liked playing with fire, especially when it could burn everything. "They won't sit still for long," Caro muttered, his eyes scanning the systems for any sign of retaliation. "This is just a stall." Jorland nodded, a flicker of his own anxiety creeping into his gut. This was more than just a simple tactical move. The Ethar would respond. They always did. But the question remained. How would they respond? Would they come crashing down on Earth with overwhelming force, or would they attempt something more subtle? Either way, humanity had bought time, and with time, they had a chance. A beeping sound interrupted their thoughts, drawing everyone's attention to the far corner of the room. The screens flickered again, but this time it wasn't just interference. A small icon blinked, indicating a new transmission. Jorland leaned forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "Put it through," he ordered. A smooth, almost melodious voice cut through the static. It wasn't a command, nor was it a demand. It was an invitation. The voice was calm, unnervingly so, as though the speaker were extending a hand in peace, offering a gesture of civility where none was warranted. "We know you are watching. We know you are listening," the voice said, each word dragging out like a slow exhale. "This is not your victory. You are merely delaying the inevitable." Jorland's grip tightened on the table. "It's a start," he muttered, his voice steady, though his heart raced. "Send them our reply," he ordered. The transmission ended, leaving a lingering silence that stretched long into the room. Jorland could feel the weight of the alien words pressing against him, but this time, it wasn't fear that gripped him. It was something else, something more dangerous. "We'll show them just how wrong they are," Jorland whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. His fingers dug into the edge of the table, grounding him. It was time to show the Ethar that humanity didn't just survive. It would make them wish they never arrived. Outside the walls of the command center, Earth remained eerily quiet, as though the planet itself were holding its breath. The alien fleet still hung in the sky, waiting. But for how long? Jorland didn't know. All he could do now was act, and whatever came next, he would face it head on. The silence inside the command center was unbearable. The once busy, cluttered room was now heavy with tension, the kind that settled deep in the bones. Outside, the alien fleet loomed, its dark ships hanging in the sky like a gathering storm. But still, there was no retaliation, no grand offensive. Instead, the quiet stretched on, Earth's forces were waiting, and Jorlin Keevan's patience was wearing thin. His fingers traced the edge of the table, the coolness of the metal grounding him as he stared at the tactical display in front of him. The room was filled with the crackling of static, the occasional murmur of officers checking systems, but there was no action, no movement. Jorlin's thoughts churned, each one heavier than the last. The plan had been simple enough: disrupt their communication, create chaos. But now, as the minutes turned to hours, he couldn't shake the feeling that the enemy was not so easily fooled. The question that gnawed at him was simple: what were they waiting for? "Commander," Caro's voice broke through his reverie, sharp and urgent. "We've got reports of anomalies in their fleet. No attacks yet, but they're shifting positions. It's as if they're reorganizing." Jorlin's eyes snapped to the screen, following Caro's motion. The once static formations of the alien ships were now beginning to move, subtly at first, but then with more purpose. Each movement felt deliberate, measured. They were responding, but not with the brute force they had expected. Something else was unfolding, something deeper. "Do you think they've figured out our plan?" Madeira's voice was small but carried a weight. Her brow was furrowed, and she gripped her console as though it were the only thing anchoring her to the reality unfolding before them. "No," Jorlin replied quickly, though his own voice held uncertainty. "Not yet. But we need to make them feel like they have. Let's keep pushing them. Disrupt everything." Madeira glanced at him, her eyes searching for the man who had always been the anchor in these moments. He could feel her doubt, but there was no time for hesitation now. "Get the pulse generators ready. We need to keep them on edge," he ordered, his tone firm, even as a chill began to settle at the back of his neck. He could hear the soft clicking of Madeira's fingers against her console as she began inputting the commands. The pulse generators were set to overload the Wythar's communication grid again, amplifying the chaos, forcing them to react. It was a risky move. Each time they sent the pulses, it drained more of Earth's resources. But it was necessary. Every move the Ythar made was being observed, catalogued. Jorlin knew that each second of their hesitation was an opportunity. A sudden burst of static interrupted their thoughts. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make the hairs on the back of Jorlin's neck stand up. The air in the room grew dense, as though a storm were building inside the walls. His eyes snapped to the screen, and then to Madeira, whose face had gone pale. The transmission had changed. The Ythar were no longer simply silent invaders. They were speaking. "Commander," Caro said, his voice thick with disbelief, "they're broadcasting to us." The words hit Jorlin like a punch to the gut. The Ythar had never communicated with them before. Their silence had been as much a weapon as their ships. Now this change. It was unsettling. "Play it," Jorlin commanded, his voice sharp. The room fell silent as the transmission began. The image was distorted, shaky at first, but then it cleared. A figure appeared on screen. It wasn't a soldier. It wasn't a general. No, it was something else. The figure was humanoid, but its features were slightly off, alien in a way that made it unsettling. It had the same lithe build as the Ythar soldiers, but its eyes were different. There was a strange intelligence there, something cold and calculating, but also curious. "Humans," the figure spoke, its voice smooth, a stark contrast to the distorted static that had preceded it. "You misunderstand our intentions. We do not seek to conquer you. We seek understanding." The words were like ice in Jorlin's veins. The air in the room felt even colder now, the temperature dropping, as if the figure's words had an actual weight that pressed in on them. Jorlin could see the ripple of unease spreading through his team, but he refused to let it take hold of him. "Understanding," Caro muttered, his disbelief palpable. "What do they mean by that?" Jorlin clenched his fists at his sides, grounding himself in the moment. This wasn't the first time an invader had tried to twist the narrative. The Ythar weren't here for peace. They were here to control. The idea of them seeking understanding was a trick, a ploy. He had to keep his mind sharp, focused. "Turn it off," Jorlin ordered, and Madeira's fingers swiftly moved to shut down the transmission. But it didn't end there. The Ythar knew they had his attention. The screen flickered again, showing another image. This time, it was a view of Earth, taken from above, from a distance. The cities were illuminated, the night sky stretching out like an infinite canvas. But as Jorlin's eyes moved across the image, something struck him. The cities, the landmasses, they were unnervingly quiet. Almost too quiet. There were no signs of military movement, no signs of rebellion. "We are not the enemy, Commander Kievan," the Ythar voice returned, its tone now softer, almost persuasive. "You have been misled. We are here to offer you a chance to join us, to evolve with us. The choice is yours." Jorlin's blood ran cold. The Ythar's manipulation was beginning to show, and it was slick, smooth, almost seductive. This was not an invasion by force, it was an invasion by choice. They wanted humanity to surrender, not through destruction but through agreement, to become part of their empire willingly. Madeira's hand trembled as she turned the transmission off, her face ashen. "What are they doing, Jorlin? Are they really trying to make us join them?" "We won't be tricked," he growled, his voice steady despite the growing unease in his chest. "Keep disrupting their communications. We'll make them feel as if they have no choice but to act. Make them regret thinking they could play this game with us." But even as he spoke, a seed of doubt had been planted in his mind. This was no ordinary invasion. The Ythar weren't just here to conquer. They were here to make humanity choose to be part of them. Jorlin's mind raced. This war was no longer about fighting. It was about resistance on a whole different level. And in the quiet spaces between their words, between their choices, Jorlin wondered if humanity could really win without becoming what they hated most. The Ythar had only just begun. And so, too, had the war. The transmission had ended, but the room still felt like it was vibrating with the weight of the Ythar's words. Jorlin could feel the tension in the air, thick and pressing against his chest. His officers were silent, their faces pale as they processed the message. It was clear. This wasn't just about brute force. The Ythar weren't here to destroy. They wanted to manipulate, to twist humanity's will until it bent to their own. "Are they playing with us?" Madeira's voice was hoarse, raw. She stood with her back to the holographic map, hands clenched into fists at her sides. Her gaze was sharp, but there was a flicker of fear in her eyes. They all felt it. Something had shifted, but Jorlin knew they couldn't show weakness. Not now. "We can't let them make us doubt ourselves," Jorlin replied, his voice firm but edged with the strain of the realization settling in. They had expected an invasion of fire and fury, but what they were facing now was far more insidious. The Ythar wanted Earth to choose them, to surrender in a way that wasn't visible. The quiet submission, not through force, but through influence. They had to fight that pull with everything they had. "We need to push back," Caro added, his face taut with urgency. "They've made their move. Now we make ours." Jorlin didn't reply at first. Instead, he stared at the tactical screen, his fingers trembling slightly as they hovered over the controls. He needed time, but time was slipping away. The Ythar were adapting to their disruption tactics faster than anticipated. The sky above was still unnaturally quiet, the fleet lingering like a shadow, not an attack force. Jorlin knew that if they didn't act soon, they would lose the advantage. "There's something else we're not seeing," Jorlin murmured. The realization crept in slowly, a chilling understanding that sank into his bones. The Ythar's quiet strategy was part of something larger, something humanity wasn't prepared for. They weren't just looking for Earth's submission, they were testing humanity's resolve, to make them question everything they stood for. Madeira stepped forward, her boots clicking softly on the metal floor as she approached the console. "What do you mean?" Jorlin's eyes flicked to hers, a grim determination in his gaze. "They're waiting for us to act. They think they can make us choose, and if we play into their hands, they'll win without firing a shot." Caro's jaw tightened, and for the first time, Jorlin saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. "So we're supposed to just wait? Let them take the initiative?" "No!" Jorlin snapped, his voice rising. He gripped the edge of the table, leaning forward. We'll push them, but we won't give them what they want. We have to keep them off balance, keep them guessing. The team fell into a heavy silence, the air thick with unspoken thoughts. The Ethar had broken the rules of war. They had turned it into a game of perception, making humanity the player who wasn't sure if the prize was worth winning. And the longer they waited, the more they fed into the Ithar's strategy. Jorlin turned to his officers, his voice now a low, controlled growl. Prepare for Operation Recoil. His eyes hardened as the weight of the mission settled over him. We'll take back control of the airwaves. The fleet has had their hands tied long enough. Caro didn't flinch, but Jorlin could see the tension knotting in his shoulders. You're sure this is going to work? Doesn't matter if it works, Jorlin said, his voice rough with intent. What matters is they'll have to react. And once they do, we'll be ready. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity, tension crackling in every corner of the resistance base. Officers and engineers moved swiftly, setting up equipment to broadcast false signals and interference across key points in the Ethar's communication channels. The fleet remained motionless, as if waiting for something to break. But every time Jorlin checked the screen, the ships didn't shift. They simply hung there, floating like a massive weight on the horizon, their guns silent, their intentions a mystery. Madeira worked beside him, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she configured the interference patterns. But Jorlin couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something. The quiet was oppressive now. Every minute felt like an eternity. His fingers itched for something, anything, that would break the tension, make them move. But the Ithar held their ground, and in that stillness, something deep inside Jorlin began to unravel. The Ithar were waiting for him, and he wasn't sure if he was prepared for what came next. Everything's ready, Madeira said, her voice laced with the same thin veneer of certainty she had worn since the beginning of the invasion. She didn't turn to look at him as she spoke. Her attention was fixed on the data streams that flickered on the screen, but Jorlin could see the strain in the curve of her shoulders. He nodded, although his own gaze never left the view of the Ithar fleet above. A bead of sweat trickled down his forehead, but he wiped it away with a sharp swipe of his hand. Then let's give them a reason to react. As the final command was issued, the pulse generators hummed to life. The sudden surge of interference shot across the globe, a web of disruption designed to choke the Ethar's ability to communicate, coordinate, and execute their next move. It wasn't a weapon, it was a tactic, a gamble. If the Ithar were truly ready for this, they would retaliate quickly. But if they weren't, they would hesitate. And that hesitation would be their downfall. The first response came faster than Jorlin had expected. An electric crackle filled the room as the Ithar's retaliation cut through the interference. It wasn't immediate, but it was significant. The fleet began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency. Sir, they're shifting. Caro's voice came through the radio, his tone tight with disbelief. They've locked onto our transmission points. They're coming in hot. Jorlin didn't speak at first. His heart pounded in his chest, but he held his ground. The moment had arrived. They had forced their hand, and now they had to stand firm. Activate the secondary grid, he said, voice steely with resolve. It's time to show them we've been one step ahead the whole time. The room was alive with the sound of commands being executed, equipment buzzing, and the distant clatter of officers in motion. As the alien fleet finally began to descend toward Earth's atmosphere, Jorlin couldn't help but feel a cold certainty wash over him. They had taken the bait. But what would they do next? The Ithar were playing a game they didn't understand. And soon, they would learn. Humans weren't afraid to fight dirty, not when it mattered. The ground trembled underfoot as Jorlin Keevan stood at the helm of the command center, his pulse quickening with each passing second. The Ithar fleet had finally made their move. The silence that had stretched across the skies had broken like glass, and now the alien ships surged toward Earth with unnerving speed. There was no more hesitation from their side, only the sharp, violent force of an impending collision. Jorlin's eyes flicked to the tactical map before him. The Ithar ships were scattered across the sky like a deadly constellation, each one moving with purpose. The air in the room felt dense, heavy with anticipation. The walls of the command center seemed to shrink, the lights overhead flickering briefly, as if struggling to keep up with the gravity of the situation. "Sir," Caro's voice cut through the haze of tension. His words were clipped, urgent. "They're locking onto our cities. This isn't a warning strike. They're going for the heart of the planet." Jorlin felt his chest tighten. He could almost hear the roar of alien engines in his mind, feel the vibrations of the assault in his bones. The Ythar were not pulling punches now. They had reached the point of no return, and Earth was at the precipice. "We've prepared for this," Jorlin said, his voice low, tight with the weight of his next words. He could see the uncertainty in the eyes of his officers, but he refused to show the same. He had led them to this point, and it was not time for hesitation. It was time to finish what they had started. "Activate the countermeasures, all of them." Madeira's fingers were already flying over her console, her brow furrowed in concentration. The screens around them flickered as the first wave of Ythar fire shot across the atmosphere, the beams of energy cutting through the clouds like lightning. Jorlin's eyes narrowed, watching the incoming projectiles, feeling his heart race with each impact that sent ripples of tension through the resistance base. The first explosions rattled the command center, the walls quaking with the force of them. The sound of crashing debris and distant fires reached their ears. Jorlin's mind was a flurry of commands and calculations as he absorbed the sight of their first assault. They had held back before, but now the Ythar were showing no mercy. It was clear that the war had escalated, and this was no longer about subtlety. This was a full-scale battle. "Shields up," Madeira called, her voice sharp as she worked feverishly at the console. "I need another minute to stabilize the comms. The pulse generators are ready for the second round." Jorlin nodded, his hand instinctively moving to the edge of the table, his fingers curling into tight fists. The pressure was unbearable, but he pushed it down. His mind was clear now. They weren't just reacting anymore, they were taking control. He had planned this moment, knew that the first wave of fire would force their hand, but this was different. The Ythar had underestimated the resilience of humanity before, and now they would understand that they had made a grave mistake. "Don't wait for my command," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "Fire when ready." The room filled with the sharp sound of buttons being pressed and the electric whir of systems coming online. Madeira's face was locked in a mask of focus as the first pulse fired. The energy field cascaded into the air, splintering the alien weapons as they reached Earth's surface. The Ythar ships, though powerful, found themselves unable to coordinate. The intricate network they relied on to unleash their destruction faltered, their targets scattering in disarray. "Direct hit!" Caro shouted, his voice tinged with disbelief. "They've lost control of their main battery systems." A feeling of grim satisfaction settled over Jorlin, but it was fleeting. He knew that this was far from over. The Ythar had anticipated something. They were too strong, too strategic to be this easily outwitted. Even as the first round of pulses disabled their weapons, Jorlin knew they would adapt. "They'll come back stronger," Caro warned, his eyes scanning the ever-shifting formations of the enemy fleet. "Let them," Jorlin said, his voice low and filled with a controlled fury. "They're playing our game now." Madeira turned to face him, her expression unreadable. She could feel it too, the same shifting undercurrent that ran through the room. The Ythar were becoming more unpredictable, more erratic. But this was where they could take control. This was the turning point. Jorlin had been preparing for this moment since the invasion began. They weren't going to just stop the Ythar, they were going to dismantle their entire strategy. As the second round of pulses began to hit their targets, sending more of the Ythar fleet into chaos, Jorlin saw the first signs of true panic among their ranks. The ships that had once moved in perfect harmony now turned in every direction, seeking shelter, struggling to communicate with each other. The cracks were starting to show. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Jorlin's gaze shifted to the vast windows overlooking the Earth below. The planet's surface was illuminated with the glow of fires, smoke rising in thick plumes from major cities. He could feel the weight of it, the lives lost, the devastation that would follow if they failed. But this was his responsibility, his decisions. He turned away from the window and met Madeira's gaze, his jaw set with grim determination. "We can break them," Jorlin said quietly, but the weight of his words settled heavily in the room. The time for subtlety had passed. The war had escalated, but now it was Earth's turn to take the lead. Then the transmission came again, quicker this time, an encrypted burst of interference that swept through their systems. The message appeared, flickering on the screen like a ghost. "We warned you," the voice said. The calmness of the words sent a chill down Jorlin's spine. The voice was the same, unnervingly calm. It was almost inviting. "This was never a war. You chose to fight. Now you will learn what happens when you challenge the inevitable." Jorlin's eyes narrowed. He could hear the hidden threat beneath those words. This was more than just an invasion. It was about something deeper, something that ran through the very bones of their struggle. The Ethar were not merely fighting for victory. They were fighting to reshape the rules of existence itself, and humanity had stepped into their game. Caro looked over at Jorlin, his eyes clouded with unease. "What does that mean, Commander? What are they really trying to do?" Jorlin's lips curled into a thin, bitter smile. "They want to make us believe there's no way out. They think we'll fall in line, just like every other world they've conquered." But Jorlin knew better. The Ithar hadn't yet seen the full force of humanity's resolve. The war had just begun, and Jorlin had a plan they wouldn't anticipate. He knew the enemy's weakness now, and he wouldn't let them win. "This is only the beginning," Jorlin muttered, turning back to the tactical screen. The alien fleet still hovered above them, uncertain but determined. But Jorlin wasn't going to let them hold the upper hand for long. The Ethar were about to learn that humans never played by their rules. Jorlin's eyes remained fixed on the tactical screen, his fingers drumming the surface of the table in a slow, rhythmic beat. The words of the Ithar still echoed in his mind, their cryptic warning hanging in the air like a thunderstorm on the horizon. He wasn't ready to believe them. He wouldn't. But something about the calm certainty in their tone made him pause, just for a fraction of a second. That pause, however, was all they needed. The Ithar had been underestimating humanity, but now, with Earth on the edge of total chaos, they'd taken the bait. The alien fleet was still high above, but the panic was starting to show. The once calculated movements had shifted into erratic pulses, signaling a shift in their strategy. Jorlin's mind spun through the possibilities. The Ethar were reacting, yes, but to what? What was their next play? "Commander," Caro's voice sliced through the silence. "We're seeing signs of internal conflict. Their fleet's movements are breaking down. It's like they're communicating differently now, as if they don't know what to do next." Jorlin's fingers paused on the console, his eyes narrowing as the chaos in the sky mirrored the chaos in his mind. The Ithar were supposed to be masters of conquest, their fleets practically flawless in execution. This confusion, this hesitation, it was new. It made no sense. "Why are they faltering?" Madeira's voice was strained, quiet, but the urgency in it was clear. "They've been calculating every move. Why not now?" Jorlin didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared at the flickering map, the lights of the Ithar fleet dimming and brightening as they adjusted course. There were gaps in their formation, small but noticeable. It felt like they were being held back, like a dam was about to burst but had just enough pressure to stop the flood. "They're not faltering," Jorlin said, his voice low. "They're rethinking. They're trying to anticipate us." A moment of silence passed through the room as his words settled. The team had been reacting to the Ithar's aggression, but now it seemed the tables were turning. The Ithar were no longer just reacting to Earth's resistance. They were now trying to predict it. The predator had become the prey. "We're making them doubt," Jorlin murmured, the realization solidifying in his chest. "But doubt doesn't always make you retreat. Sometimes it makes you desperate." Madeira turned back to her console, her eyes wide as she watched the energy reading spike on her screen. "Sir, I'm seeing an increase in their energy levels. They're preparing for something." Before she could finish, the room was suddenly flooded with a sharp screech, like metal scraping against metal. The air felt heavier, more charged, and Jorland's instincts flared. He was on his feet before anyone could react, every nerve in his body screaming that something was wrong. "Brace for impact," he barked, his heart hammering in his chest. He didn't wait to see the confusion in his officers' faces. They were all trained for this moment. A moment later, the walls of the command center shook, rattling with a force that sent everyone stumbling. The tremors came in waves, sharp and jagged. It wasn't just an attack. It was an attempt to break them down from the inside out. The Ythar were striking at Earth's core, trying to disrupt them before they could respond. "Report!" Jorland shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We've lost secondary systems," Caro said, his voice tight with urgency. "The Ythar are using some kind of focused pulse weapon. It's targeting our power grids." Jorland's stomach churned. They had expected an all-out assault, but this was different. The Ythar were striking strategically. They weren't just attacking. They were dismantling Earth's infrastructure, piece by piece. The weight of their approach settled on Jorland's shoulders like a leaden cloak. This was no longer just a war of tactics. It was a battle for survival, and humanity was on the precipice. "Lock down the grid," Jorland ordered, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "Get the generators online now. We need power, or this ends here." The room buzzed with frantic activity, the rush of commands and the furious tapping of fingers against screens. There was no time to waste. The Ythar had given them no breathing room. It was all-out war, and every second counted. "Commander," Madeira called, her voice tight with a mix of frustration and fear. "I can't stabilize the communications. The pulse weapon is affecting more than just the grid. We're blind, sir." Jorland ground his teeth together. They were being boxed in on all sides. The Ythar weren't just attacking. They were making a statement. They were trying to force humanity into submission without ever firing a single shot. The pulse was both a weapon and a psychological attack. And it was working. The resistance had always been prepared for a physical battle, but now they had to fight on another level. The Ythar had made this personal. They weren't just here to conquer, they were here to break humanity's spirit. "We'll make it work," Jorland said, his voice firm, even as a cold wave of dread washed over him. "We've been through worse. This is just another challenge. Don't let them see fear. Not now." The officers nodded, but the strain in their eyes told Jorland everything he needed to know. They were scared. They weren't just fighting an invading force anymore. They were fighting the very core of their beliefs, of their future. And that was something far more dangerous than any weapon. As Madeira and Caro worked to restore communication systems, Jorland allowed himself a moment to think. He had always known this day might come. He had always known that, when pushed to the limit, humanity's greatest weapon would be something more than guns and bombs. It would be their ability to adapt, to endure, to fight back when every system told them it was over. The Ythar hadn't understood that. They thought Earth would fall into line like every other world they had crushed beneath their heel. But they had forgotten one thing about humanity. They had underestimated them. Jorland turned back to the window, his eyes narrowing as he stared out at the sky. The Ythar fleet still hung there, unmoving, but ever present. The question now was not whether they could win. It was how far they would push before they realized the mistake they had made. And Jorland was going to make sure that by the time they realized it, it would be too late. "The war isn't just about force," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "It's about what we're willing to lose to win." The pulse from the alien weapons had not only shaken the infrastructure, but it had torn through their sense of security. Earth had survived its first round of blows, but Jorland knew better than to celebrate. The Ythar weren't simply trying to destroy. They were dismantling humanity's confidence, piece by piece. Jorland stood at the center of the room, his back to the flickering map, his mind calculating the next steps. It was more than just retaliation now. It was about survival. The room smelled faintly of oil and burning circuits, nothing out of the ordinary for a place under siege. But to Jorland, it felt like the universe was collapsing in on itself. The tension in the air was palpable, thickening around them with every minute. Madeira and Caro were hard at work, their eyes flicking between multiple screens, but the fear was there, unspoken, simmering just beneath the surface. It was in the tightness of their shoulders, in the hesitations of their commands. They were on edge, but it wasn't the kind of edge that would break them. Not yet. "Sir, the Yathar are focusing all their remaining resources on disabling our communication networks." Madeira's voice came through, sharp and controlled, though her fingers were trembling. "They're isolating Earth from the rest of the systems. We're completely cut off." Jorlin's gaze flicked to the tactical map again. The Yathar fleet was moving again, but this time their formation was tighter, more deliberate. Their ships loomed like dark monoliths, casting long shadows that stretched across the globe. The world was a battlefield now, every inch of land, sky, and sea weighed down by the looming presence of the invaders. "We knew this would happen," Jorlin said, the words falling from his lips with a certainty that surprised even him. He met Caro's eyes, seeing the same spark of defiance burning in his officer's gaze. "They're trying to strangle us, but we're not going to make it that easy for them." Caro nodded, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "What's the next move?" "We make them regret that mistake," Jorlin said, his voice low and steady, the weight of his decision settling over him like a mantle. He wasn't sure how, but they had to fight back. There was no room for second chances, no space for doubt. The alien fleet had one advantage. They thought they were controlling the flow of battle. It was time to turn that perception on its head. Jorlin moved to the central command station, his fingers flying over the keys. They had a limited window before the Ithar could adjust their strategy. The power grid was failing, communication was broken, and Earth's cities were in flames, but Jorlin still had a card to play. His mind worked quickly, envisioning every possible scenario, each action, each countermeasure. There was no luxury of time. "Activate the subspace relays," Jorlin commanded, the words spilling out with purpose. "We'll overload their communication channels. Make them think we're using the grid to coordinate massive counterattacks. We need to give them something to chase." Madeira's eyes widened as the implications of the order sank in. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, but then her fingers flew across the console. "It's risky, but it might just work." Jorlin turned to face the rest of his team. "We're not waiting for them to make the first move anymore. We're pushing back." The room was alive with energy now, as officers scrambled to execute the plan. The subspace relays flickered to life, sending out signals that would make it seem as though humanity's forces were mobilizing on a massive scale. It would overload the Ythar's communication systems. The Ythar would think they were facing an all-out war on multiple fronts. They would waste precious time and resources trying to manage a threat that wasn't really there. Caro leaned forward, eyes narrowing as he scanned the data on his console. "It's working. The Ithar are reacting to our signals. They're scrambling their ships, trying to redirect resources." Jorlin allowed himself a tight, grim smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The Yathar were being forced to fight a phantom enemy. The battle was no longer a one-sided affair. "Now we do what they least expect," Jorlin muttered, watching the fleet in the distance. It had become more chaotic, the once disciplined alien forces now acting erratically. The calm of their ships had been replaced with the harsh sounds of panic. They thought they were being attacked on all fronts. The plan was working. Madeira's voice came through, calm but urgent. "Sir, their energy output is fluctuating. They're diverting power from weapons to shields. They've shifted focus to defense." Jorlin didn't need to think twice. "Now's our chance. Fire the pulse disruptors." The room vibrated with the power surging through the system. The pulse disruptors, which had been lying in wait, powered up, sending an enormous shockwave across the atmosphere. It was a brutal, calculated move. The Ythar fleet, already on edge from the disinformation campaign, had no time to respond before their defenses were overwhelmed. The pulse sent an electromagnetic blast that tore through their shields, disorienting them, leaving them vulnerable to a follow-up strike. The sound of crackling electricity filled the room as the first wave of energy hit the alien fleet. The screens flickered, showing the cascading effects of the pulse as Ythar ships began to lose control, their systems locking up. They weren't prepared for this level of disruption. Caro's voice rang out with a mixture of awe and relief. "It's working, Commander. We're gaining ground." Jorlin stood still, his mind racing. They had taken the first step toward a victory, but he knew better than to celebrate. The Ithar weren't finished yet. He had seen their resilience in the past. They would adapt, counter, and strike again. But the ground had shifted, and for the first time since the invasion began, Jorlin could feel the tide turning. "We've only got a moment," Jorlin said, his eyes scanning the shifting positions of the alien fleet. "We need to capitalize on this. All forces, prepare for a direct strike." He didn't wait for the response. The order had been given. The pulse disruptors were only the first phase. The real strike, Earth's retaliation, was coming. The fight for humanity's survival had entered a new phase, and Jorlin was ready to make the Ithar realize they had underestimated everything about humanity. It wasn't about brute force. It wasn't about overwhelming the enemy. It was about showing them something they could never anticipate: humanity's ability to outthink, outlast, and outmaneuver. The Ithar had thought they understood Earth. Now, they would learn just how wrong they were. The alien fleet had broken formation, confused and vulnerable. Earth's forces were preparing for their next move. And this time the Ithar were about to experience the full force of humanity's resolve. Jorlin glanced one last time at the sky. The fleet was still there, but no longer untouchable. "Let them see what happens when they push humanity too far," he muttered, his voice low yet resolute. Jorlin didn't need to hear the sounds of their weapons fire or the chaos in the skies above. The quiet of the command center was enough to know. The Ithar fleet was crumbling. For the first time since the invasion began, they were no longer a force with unstoppable momentum. They were floundering, uncertain, disoriented, vulnerable. He stood still, his eyes fixed on the tactical screen as the last of their interference devices worked its magic. The enemy ships, once so poised and sure, were now scattered. They could no longer predict humanity's next move. They had underestimated Earth's capacity to adapt, to fight, and to survive. "Sir," Madeira said, her voice breaking through the tense silence, "their formations are in disarray. They've lost control of their weapon systems. Their command network is fragmented. We've won." Jorlin didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let the weight of the moment settle on him. There was a deep sense of finality in the air, one that had been building for months, but now it felt like a quiet victory. His mind wasn't on the celebrations that would come, or the accolades they'd receive. No, his mind was focused on the bigger picture. The Ithar had learned the most painful lesson of all. Humanity would never bow. Earth would never be a planet to conquer, but one to reckon with. "They thought we'd give up," Caro's voice rang out from the back of the room, sharp with disbelief. "They thought we were weak, but they never understood what we were fighting for." Jorlin turned to look at Caro, seeing the fire in his eyes, the same fire that had burned in every soldier, every officer, every civilian who had ever faced impossible odds. That fire had always been humanity's greatest strength, and today it had shown the Ithar just what they were capable of. "They never understood us," Jorlin said, his voice low, calm. "They thought they could break us, but they didn't realize the truth, that we don't just survive, we thrive. That's what sets us apart. We don't just fight to win, we fight for what we are, for who we are." Madeira looked up from her console, her expression hardening with conviction. This wasn't just about saving Earth. This was about showing the galaxy what it means to be human. It's about making them see that we're not some easy target to be crushed. We're a force that will never be erased. A deep, satisfied silence settled in the room as the reality of their victory began to sink in. The alien fleet had broken, their ships now tumbling in disarray. The once unfathomable technology of the Ithar was now powerless, its defenses rendered meaningless by the humanity's ingenuity and unyielding will. They had expected to find a species to conquer, to crush beneath their boots, but instead, they had found an enemy they could never defeat. Jorlin let out a long breath, his gaze never leaving the stars outside the command center. The war wasn't just about the physical destruction. It had been a battle of wills, and humanity had triumphed. The Ithar had underestimated Earth's power to endure and adapt, and now they would learn the price of that miscalculation. They wanted a war, Jorlin said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to fill the entire room. And they got one, but not the one they expected. Caro let out a short, bitter laugh. No, they got something far worse. They got us, and we're not the same as they thought. The battle might have been won, but the lesson was far from over. Earth had proven that they were not just survivors, they were conquerors in their own right. The Ithar had fallen not because of overwhelming force, but because humanity refused to bend. The real war had never been about destroying the enemy. It had been about showing them that they were the ones who would be consumed by their own ambition. Get a message to the Wythar fleet, Jorlin said, his tone hardening, shifting to something darker. Tell them we're not finished. This is just the beginning. Madeira's fingers flew across the console, sending out a clear, unmistakable signal to the alien invaders. The message was simple, direct, and filled with the kind of resolution that would make even the most hardened invader pause. Earth is not your prize. It is your cage. And now, you belong to us. Jorlin let out a slow breath, turning back to the map. He could feel the weight of the moment, the realization of just how far Earth had come. The Ithar had no idea what they had started when they set their eyes on Earth. Now it was their turn to face the consequences of their arrogance. They wanted to break us, to enslave us, Jorlin said, his eyes fixed on the shattered remnants of the Ithar fleet. But they didn't understand what we were made of. They didn't understand that we've been through worse, that we've always fought for our place in the universe. He stood taller now, his resolve solidifying like steel. The Ithar had underestimated them, and they would pay the price for that mistake. Humanity wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for their right to define their own destiny. Caro's voice cut through the room, low but steady. We've shown them that we're not just another world to conquer. We're humanity. And if they want to take us, they'll have to learn how to survive us first. Jorlin turned to face his team, each of them standing tall, their eyes bright with the same unwavering certainty that had carried them through the darkest moments of the war. They were more than soldiers. They were the embodiment of Earth itself, a force that had faced extinction, that had been pushed to the brink, and had come out the other side unbroken, more powerful than ever. The battle for Earth was over, but the real fight had just begun. Jorlin took one last look at the sky above, his voice a low rumble that reverberated in the stillness of the room. This isn't just about victory. This is about making sure they never forget what happens when you push humanity too far. The Ithar would retreat, broken and shattered. They would return to their home worlds with a lesson burned into their very souls. Never again would they underestimate humanity. Jorlin's eyes burned with a fierce, unshakable conviction. We'll show them what it means to fight for something worth protecting. Earth belongs to us, and anyone who tries to take it will learn the true meaning of resistance. As he turned away from the command center, the first light of dawn began to break through the windows, casting a warm glow over the team that had carried humanity's hope. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Earth would never be anyone's prize to claim. It would always be a force that could not be conquered. And as long as humanity stood, there would be no one who could stop them.